The first gunshot echoed across the Montana plains as Roswell Ingram's body hit the dirt, blood seeping through his faded blue shirt. His so-called partners had finally made their move, deciding that 3 ways to split their stolen fortune was one too many. The year was 1876, and in the unforgiving territory west of Helena, Montana, a man's life was worth less than the coins in his pocket. Jane Davenport pulled her mare to an abrupt halt when she heard the distant gunfire. She'd been making her weekly journey from her small homestead to Helena for supplies, a trip she'd made alone since her father's passing last winter. The 24-year-old straightened in her saddle, listening intently. The shots had come from the direction of Cedar Creek, a meandering stream that cut through the prairie about a quarter-mile east. Jane wasn't one to seek trouble, but something compelled her to investigate. Perhaps it was the loneliness of frontier life or simply human curiosity. She turned her horse toward the creek, her hand instinctively moving to the small revolver tucked in her saddlebag. Her father had taught her to shoot when she was just 12, insisting no woman should be defenseless on the frontier. As she approached the creek, she saw 2 riders galloping away to the north, dust clouds marking their hasty departure. Jane dismounted carefully, tethering her mare to a young cottonwood before proceeding on foot. The tall grass whispered against her skirts as she made her way toward where she'd seen movement near the water's edge. When Jane found him, she thought he was already dead. The man lay sprawled beside the creek, one hand trailing in the water, his hat upturned beside him. Blood darkened the earth beneath his torso. Jane knelt beside him, her breath catching when she saw his chest rise slightly. "Sir," she whispered, not wanting to startle him. "Can you hear me?" His eyelids fluttered, revealing pain-clouded blue eyes. His lips moved, but no sound emerged. Jane quickly assessed his wounds. A bullet had torn through his left shoulder, and another had grazed his side. Serious, but perhaps not fatal if she acted quickly. "I'm going to help you," she said firmly, more to convince herself than him. "But I need to get you to my homestead. It's not far." The wounded man tried to speak again, managing only a hoarse whisper. "They took—" "Don't try to talk," Jane interrupted. "Save your strength. I need to move you." Getting an unconscious man onto her horse proved nearly impossible, but Jane was no stranger to hard labor. After several failed attempts and considerable struggle, she managed to drape him over her mare's back, securing him with rope from her saddlebag. She led the horse slowly, careful not to jostle her unexpected patient more than necessary. Jane's homestead came into view as the sun began its descent, a modest cabin with a small barn and corral, nestled against a grove of pines for protection from the harsh winter winds. It had been her home for nearly a decade, since her father had claimed the land after the war. Now it was hers alone, a fact that brought both pride and loneliness. With considerable effort, Jane maneuvered the unconscious man into her cabin and onto her bed. She cut away his bloodied shirt, revealing a muscular chest marred by not only fresh wounds but old scars as well. This man was no stranger to violence. She cleaned his wounds with water and whiskey, her hands steady despite her racing heart. The bullet in his shoulder would need to come out. Jane had assisted the doctor in Helena a few times when hands were scarce, and she'd helped her father through a bout of lead poisoning after a hunting accident. She knew the basics, but removing a bullet was different. Still, she had no choice. If infection set in, he would certainly die. Taking a deep breath, Jane sterilized her father's pocketknife in the flame of a candle and prepared to extract the bullet. The man groaned as she probed the wound, his eyes flying open. "Be still," she commanded. "I'm trying to help you." His gaze focused on her face, confusion evident. "Who?" "My name is Jane Davenport. You've been shot. I found you by Cedar Creek." Recognition flickered in his eyes, followed by alarm. He attempted to sit up but fell back with a groan. "They'll come back." "Who will?" Jane asked, pressing him gently back against the pillow. "Cassidy." "And Wade," he managed. "They took the money." Jane's stomach tightened. She'd heard stories in town about a stage robbery near, but last week, 3 men had made off with a substantial payroll bound for the silver mines. "You're one of the robbers," she said, not a question but a statement. The man closed his eyes briefly. "Yes," he admitted, "but they double-crossed me." Jane considered her options. She could turn him in. Helena was only an hour's ride away, but in his condition, he wouldn't survive the journey to face justice. And something about leaving a defenseless man to die, criminal or not, went against everything she believed. "What's your name?" she asked, returning to the task of treating his wounds. "Roswell," he replied after a moment's hesitation. "Roswell Ingram." "Well, Mr. Ingram, I'm going to remove this bullet and it's going to hurt, but if I don't, you'll die." A ghost of a smile crossed his pale lips. "Not much. Choice then." Jane gave him a strip of leather to bite down on, then began the delicate process of extracting the bullet. Roswell's body tensed, but he made no sound beyond a muffled groan. The bullet came free with a sickening sound, and Jane dropped it into a bowl beside the bed. She quickly cleaned and bandaged both wounds, then mixed a tincture of willow bark for the pain and fever that would surely follow. When she'd finished, Roswell had slipped back into unconsciousness. Jane pulled a chair beside the bed and settled in for a long night. She knew the next 24 hours would determine whether he lived or died, and she found herself desperately hoping for the former, despite knowing nothing about the man except that he was a thief who'd been betrayed by his partners. Through the night, Roswell's fever spiked. Jane bathed his forehead with cool water, changed his bandages when blood seeped through, and spoke soothing words when he thrashed in delirium. By dawn, she was exhausted but determined. This man's life was in her hands and she would not surrender it easily. The morning brought no improvement. Jane forced small sips of broth between Roswell's cracked lips and continued her vigilant care. She had responsibilities outside animals to tend, water to fetch, but she did these chores in hurried bursts, rushing back to check on her patient. On the second day, Roswell's fever broke. Jane had fallen asleep in her chair when a hoarse voice woke her. "Water, please." She started awake to find Roswell watching her, his eyes clearer than before. Jane quickly brought him a cup, supporting his head as he drank. "How do you feel?" "Like I've been trampled by a herd of buffalo," he replied, his voice stronger than she expected. "But I'm alive, thanks to you." "You're not out of danger yet," Jane warned. "Those wounds could still fester." Roswell nodded, then studied her face. "Why did you help me? You know what I am." Jane considered the question as she checked his bandages. "I don't believe in leaving a man to die, no matter what he's done. My father taught me that every life has value. Your father sounds like a wise man." "He was," Jane replied, a shadow crossing her face. "He died last winter, pneumonia." "I'm sorry," Roswell said, and she was surprised by the genuine empathy in his voice. "You live here alone now?" Jane nodded. "It's not easy, but this land is mine. I won't abandon it." Roswell's gaze traveled around the small cabin, taking in the simple but comfortable furnishings, the shelves lined with preserved foods, the carefully mended curtains. "You've made a real home here." Something about the wistfulness in his voice made Jane curious. "Where is your home, Mr. Ingram?" His expression hardened. "I haven't had one since I was 16. My father threw me out for fighting with his new wife. I've been drifting ever since." "Is that how you fell in with thieves?" Roswell looked away. "It's a long story, Miss Davenport." "Well," Jane said, rising to stir a pot of stew simmering on the stove, "it seems you'll be here for a while. We have time for long stories." Over the next few days, as Roswell grew stronger, Jane learned his story in pieces. He'd worked as a ranch hand, a miner, and even briefly as a deputy in a small Nebraska town. But the restlessness in his blood had always driven him onward. He'd fallen in with Wade and Cassidy 6 months ago in Denver, lured by the promise of easy money. "The stage robbery wasn't my first," he admitted one evening as Jane changed his bandages. "But I swear it was going to be my last. I was planning to take my share and head to California, start fresh. And now, Jane asked, curious despite herself. Roswell's expression darkened. Now I have nothing. They took it all, the money, my horse, even my gun. Perhaps it's a sign, Jane suggested. A chance to start over the right way, he laughed, though there was little humor in it. The right way is a lot harder, Miss Davenport. Call me Jane, she said. And yes, it is harder. Most worthwhile things are. As days turned into a week, Roswell began to regain his strength. Jane found him to be an unexpectedly pleasant companion. He told stories that made her laugh, listened attentively when she spoke of her dreams for the homestead, and gradually began to help with small tasks around the cabin. One afternoon, Jane returned from collecting eggs to find Roswell standing at the stove, stirring a pot of beans. "You shouldn't be up," she scolded, though she couldn't suppress a smile at seeing him on his feet. "I've been lying in that bed for over a week," he replied. "Any longer and I'll forget how to walk. Besides, it's time I earned my keep. You're still healing." "I'm well enough to stir beans," he insisted. "I'd go crazy just lying there while you do all the work." Jane relented, secretly pleased by his consideration. That evening they shared the meal. He had prepared beans with salt pork and cornbread Jane had baked earlier. They talked easily, and Jane found herself studying his face in the lamplight, the strong jawline, the small scar above his right eyebrow, the way his eyes crinkled at the corners when he smiled. He was handsome, she realized with a jolt, and the thought unsettled her. As the dishes were cleared away, Roswell broached a subject they'd both been avoiding. "I should leave soon. Those men might come looking for me, and I don't want to bring trouble to your door." Jane's heart sank unexpectedly. "You're not well enough to travel yet." "I'm stronger every day, thanks to you, and I've been thinking about what you said about starting over the right way." He hesitated. "There's a ranch about 20 miles north of Helena. The owner, old Sam Miller, offered me work once, said I had a way with horses. You're going to be a ranch hand." Jane asked, unable to hide her surprise. Roswell smiled ruefully. "It's honest work. I did it before and I was good at it. Maybe I can be again." Jane nodded slowly. "I think that's wise. But before I go," he continued, his expression growing serious, "I need to warn you. Wade and Cassidy, they're dangerous men. If they find out someone helped me, they might come here." Fear flashed through Jane, but she squared her shoulders. "I can take care of myself. My father made sure of that." "I don't doubt your courage," Roswell said, "but these men. They won't hesitate to hurt a woman." Jane thought of her revolver, of the shotgun mounted above the door. "Let them try," she said with more bravado than she felt. Roswell studied her face, then nodded slowly. "At least let me repair that loose board on your back door before I go. And maybe show you a few tricks with that revolver I saw in your saddlebag." 2 more days passed, and Roswell continued to regain his strength. True to his word, he repaired the back door and several other items around the homestead. He took Jane behind the cabin and gave her pointers on her shooting technique, impressed by her natural ability. His shoulder wound still limited his movement, but he pushed through the discomfort, determined to be useful. Jane found herself dreading his departure more with each passing day. The cabin had felt so empty after her father died, but Roswell's presence had filled it again, not just with another body, but with conversation, laughter, and a warmth she hadn't realized she'd been missing. On what was to be his last evening at the homestead, Jane prepared a special meal, venison stew with dumplings, her father's favorite. They ate by candlelight, an unusual luxury Jane typically reserved for holidays. "This is delicious," Roswell said appreciatively. "You're a fine cook, Jane." "My mother taught me before she died," Jane replied. "She said a woman needs to know how to nourish body and soul." She was right. Roswell's gaze lingered on her face. "Your parents raised an extraordinary daughter." Jane felt her cheeks warm. "You hardly know me, Mr. Ingram." "Roswell," he corrected gently. "And I think I know you better than you realize. You took in a wounded stranger, risked your safety to save his life, and showed him kindness he didn't deserve. That tells me all I need to know about your character." Jane looked down at her plate, uncomfortable with his praise. "Anyone would have done the same." "No," Roswell said firmly. They wouldn't. Most would have left me to die or turned me in to the sheriff. You saw a man in need and helped him, regardless of the cost. That's rare, Jane. The sincerity in his voice made her meet his eyes again. What she saw there, admiration, gratitude, and something warmer, made her heart beat faster. I'm glad I found you, she admitted softly. So am I, he replied, reaching across the table to touch her hand briefly. More than you know. The moment was interrupted by the distant sound of hooves approaching. Jane tensed, exchanging an alarmed glance with Roswell. They weren't expecting visitors, and few people came this way except for the occasional traveler asking directions. Roswell rose quickly, moving to the window with a fluidity that belied his injuries. He peered out into the gathering dusk, his body suddenly rigid. It's them, he said, his voice tight. Wade and Cassidy. Jane's blood ran cold. Are you sure? Positive. I'd know Cassidy's bay anywhere. He turned to Jane, his expression grim. They must have tracked me here somehow. What do we do? Jane asked, already moving toward the shotgun. Roswell intercepted her, his hands gripping her shoulders. Listen to me. I'll go out there, try to lead them away. You stay inside, keep the door barred. No, Jane protested. They'll kill you, you're still weak from your wounds. Better me than both of us, he argued. Jane, please, I couldn't bear it if something happened to you because of me. The genuine concern in his eyes nearly undid her, but Jane steeled herself. This is my home, Roswell. I won't hide while you face them alone. Before he could respond, a voice called from outside. Ingram, we know you're in there. Come out and face us like a man, Roswell cursed under his breath. They're not going to leave, Jane. Then we face them together, she said, reaching again for the shotgun. This time, Roswell didn't stop her. Instead, he retrieved her revolver from its place on the shelf. Stay behind me, he instructed. If things go wrong, don't hesitate to shoot. Jane nodded, her mouth dry with fear but her resolve firm. Roswell moved to the door, took a deep breath, and called out, I'm coming out, Wade, just me and you two. Leave the woman out of it. The woman, came the mocking reply. Found yourself a nursemaid, did you, Ingram? Roswell opened the door and stepped onto the porch, keeping his body between Jane and the two men on horseback in her yard. Jane followed, the shotgun held steady in her hands but partially concealed behind Roswell's back. The men were a study in contrasts: Wade, lean and sallow-faced with a patchy beard, and Cassidy, broad-shouldered with a thick mustache and cold eyes. Both had their guns drawn. Thought we'd finished you off, Wade sneered. Should have put a bullet in your head when I had the chance. Why didn't you? Roswell asked, his voice remarkably calm. Lost your nerve, Wade. Wade's face darkened. We came back to fix that mistake, but now we've got two problems instead of one. His gaze shifted to Jane. Sorry, madam, but you picked the wrong man to help. I think I'm the one who should be apologizing, Jane replied steadily, for what's about to happen to you if you don't leave my property right now. Cassidy laughed, an ugly sound. Listen to her, Wade, got herself a real spitfire here. Last chance, Roswell said. Ride away. You've got the money, I'm no threat to you. Can't take that chance, Wade replied. You know our faces, our names, and so does she now. In that moment, Jane knew they intended to kill both of them, regardless of what was said. She saw Roswell's shoulders tense, sensed he'd reached the same conclusion. Without warning, he dove to the side, shouting, Now, Jane! Jane raised the shotgun and fired in one fluid motion. The blast caught Cassidy in the chest, knocking him from his horse. At the same moment, Roswell fired the revolver at Wade, who returned fire as his horse reared in panic. Wade's shot went wide, but Roswell's found its mark. Wade clutched his side, his face contorted with pain and fury as he struggled to control his frightened horse. You'll pay for this. He snarled, firing again wildly before spurring his horse away from the homestead. Leaving his fallen partner behind, when the dust settled, Jane found herself trembling, the spent shotgun still clutched in her hands. Roswell approached Cassidy's body cautiously, confirming he was dead before turning to Jane with concern. Are you all right? He asked, gently taking the shotgun from her rigid fingers. Jane nodded numbly. I've never killed a man before. Roswell pulled her into his arms, holding her as the first shock wave passed through her. "You did what you had to do. He would have killed us both." Jane buried her face against his chest, drawing strength from his steady heartbeat. After a moment, she pulled back slightly. "Wade's still out there. He's wounded, but—" "He'll be back," Roswell finished grimly. "And he'll bring others. We need to leave, Jane. Leave? This is my home." "It's not safe anymore," Roswell insisted. "Not until Wade is dealt with. We need to go to the sheriff in Helena, tell him what happened." Jane looked around at the homestead she'd built with her father, the only home she'd known since childhood. The thought of abandoning it, even temporarily, sent a wave of despair through her. But Roswell was right. Wade knew where she lived now, and he would return seeking vengeance. "All right," she agreed reluctantly. "We'll go to Helena, but what about him?" She gestured toward Cassidy's body. "We'll take him with us as evidence of what happened," Roswell said. "The sheriff needs to know the whole story about the robbery, about Wade, about everything." "Everything?" Jane asked, studying his face. "You'll confess to the robbery?" Roswell's expression was resolute. "Yes, I told you I wanted to start over the right way." "That means owning up to what I've done." Jane felt a surge of admiration for his courage. "They'll arrest you." "Probably," he acknowledged. "But I'll tell them how you saved my life, how you had no idea who I was when you found me. They'll understand you're innocent in all this." The thought of Roswell in jail, possibly facing years of imprisonment or worse, made Jane's heart constrict. There must be another way. "This is the only honorable path, Jane," he said gently, "and I need to take it for myself and for you." They worked quickly, gathering essential supplies and preparing for the journey to Helena. Roswell carefully wrapped Cassidy's body in a tarpaulin and secured it on Jane's spare horse. By the time they were ready to depart, night had fallen, making travel risky. They decided to set out at first light, taking turns keeping watch through the night. As Jane sat on the porch during her watch, rifle across her lap, she contemplated the strange turn her life had taken. 2 weeks ago, she'd been a solitary woman managing her homestead, her future stretching before her in a predictable pattern of seasons and chores. Now she'd killed a man, allied herself with an admitted criminal, and was preparing to abandon her home. Yet beneath the fear and uncertainty, Jane recognized something else, a feeling of being fully alive for the first time since her father's death. Roswell had awakened something in her, not just romantic feelings, though those were undeniably present, but a reminder that life could still surprise her, challenge her, offer her more than mere survival. When dawn broke, they mounted their horses, Jane on her mare, Roswell on her father's old gelding, with Cassidy's body secured to the spare horse. They rode toward Helena at a steady pace, both alert for any sign of Wade or his potential allies. "What will you do if they sentence me to prison?" Roswell asked as they crested a hill overlooking the valley. "Will you return to your homestead?" "Not until Wade is caught," Jane replied. "After that, I don't know. It wouldn't be the same being there alone again." Roswell studied her profile against the morning light. "You wouldn't have to be alone, Jane. There are plenty of good men in Montana who would be blessed to have a woman like you." "Perhaps," she said noncommittally. The truth was, she couldn't imagine another man in her life now. In the short time she'd known him, Roswell Ingram had carved out a place in her heart that no one else could fill. They reached Helena by midday, the small but growing town bustling with activity. Heads turned as they rode down the main street, Cassidy's shrouded body drawing curious and alarmed stares. They headed directly for the sheriff's office, a sturdy building with barred windows and a worn wooden sign. Sheriff Thomas Blackwell was a broad-shouldered man with a graying beard and skeptical eyes. He listened in silence as Roswell recounted the whole story: the stage robbery, the betrayal, Jane finding him wounded, and finally, Wade and Cassidy's attack on the homestead. Jane confirmed the parts she'd witnessed, including her role in Cassidy's death. When they finished, Blackwell leaned back in his chair, regarding them thoughtfully. "That's quite a tale, Mr. Ingram, and you're confessing to being part of the butt payroll robbery?" "I am," Roswell said firmly. I'm prepared to face the consequences of my actions, but I want it known that Miss Davenport is innocent in all this. She had no knowledge of who I was when she saved my life. And the money? The sheriff asked. All $5,000. Wade and Cassidy have it, Roswell replied. Or had it. I never saw my share. Blackwell scratched his beard thoughtfully. Well, I'll need to wire the authorities in Butte, and we'll organize a posse to go after Wade. A wounded man shouldn't be too hard to track. He turned his attention to Jane. Miss Davenport, your actions were clearly self-defense. I don't anticipate any charges against you, but I would advise staying in town until this matter is resolved. I understand, Jane said, though her heart sank at the thought of being separated from her homestead indefinitely. As for you, Ingram, the sheriff continued, I'm afraid I'll need to keep you in custody pending word from Butte. Roswell nodded, having expected nothing less. I understand, Sheriff. You can say your goodbyes, Blackwell said, rising from his desk. I'll give you a few minutes of privacy before I have to lock you up. When they were alone, Roswell took Jane's hands in his. I'm sorry about all of this, Jane. I never meant to bring such trouble into your life. I'm not sorry, she replied firmly. Not for helping you, not for anything that's happened since. Even though it's cost you your home, your peace of mind. Those things can be reclaimed, Jane said. What matters is that we're both alive and you're doing the right thing now. Roswell's eyes softened as he gazed at her. You're an extraordinary woman, Jane Davenport, in another life under different circumstances. Don't, Jane whispered, pressing her fingers to his lips. Don't talk as if this is the end. Wade will be caught and perhaps the authorities in Butte will show mercy given your cooperation. Perhaps, Roswell said, though his tone suggested he thought it unlikely. Whatever happens, I want you to know that meeting you has changed me. You've reminded me that there's goodness in this world worth fighting for. Before Jane could respond, the sheriff returned. With a final, lingering look at Jane, Roswell allowed himself to be led away to the cells at the back of the building. Jane found herself adrift in Helena, a town she visited regularly, but had never stayed in overnight. The sheriff recommended a respectable boarding house run by a widow named Mrs. Peterson, and Jane secured a small room there, using some of the money she'd brought for supplies. That evening, as she sat alone in her sparse room, the events of the past 2 weeks crashed over her like a wave. She wept for the man she'd killed, for the home she'd left behind, and for Roswell, whose fate hung in the balance. When the tears subsided, she found herself feeling oddly cleansed, her resolve stronger than before. The next morning, Jane presented herself at the sheriff's office, asking to speak with Roswell. Blackwell hesitated but eventually agreed to allow a brief visit, escorting her to the cells personally. Roswell looked up in surprise when she appeared, rising quickly from the narrow cot that served as his bed. "Jane, I didn't expect to see you. Did you think I'd abandon you now?" she asked, approaching the bars that separated them. Sheriff Blackwell cleared his throat. "I'll give you 10 minutes, Miss Davenport, then I'm afraid you'll have to leave." When they were alone, Roswell reached through the bars to take her hand. "You shouldn't be here, Jane. There's nothing you can do." "That's not true," she replied firmly. "I've been thinking all night. I'm going to speak to the stage company, explain that you've turned yourself involuntarily. Perhaps they'll be lenient if they understand you're trying to make amends." Roswell shook his head. "It's kind of you, but I doubt it will make much difference. Armed robbery is a serious offense, Jane. I could be looking at years in prison, if not worse." "Then I'll wait," Jane declared, surprising herself with her own certainty. "However long it takes, Roswell, I'll wait for you." Roswell's expression softened into disbelief. "Jane, you can't mean that. You hardly know me." "I know enough," she insisted. "I know you're a good man who made bad choices. I know you risked your life to protect me. I know that when I'm with you, I feel more alive than I have in years." "Jane," he whispered, his voice rough with emotion, "what you're suggesting? It's too much to ask of anyone." "You're not asking," she pointed out. "I'm offering, unless you don't feel the same way." Roswell's fingers tightened around hers. How I feel isn't the issue. I care for you more than I thought possible after knowing someone such a short time. But I won't let you waste your life waiting for a man behind bars. It's my life, Jane said stubbornly. My choice. Before Roswell could respond, they heard the front door of the sheriff's office open, followed by voices, one of them Blackwell's, the other unfamiliar. A moment later, the sheriff appeared at the cell door with another man, well dressed in a tailored suit despite the frontier setting. Mr. Ingram, Blackwell said. This is Mr. Horace Wilson from the Helena branch of Western Union. He's received some news from Butt that concerns you. Wilson stepped forward, adjusting his spectacles. Mr. Ingram, we've received a telegram from the authorities in Butt regarding the stage robbery. It seems that yesterday afternoon, a man named Edward Wade was apprehended trying to board a train east. He was wounded and in possession of nearly $5,000, the full amount stolen from the payroll shipment. Jane gasped, her eyes flying to Roswell's face. He looked equally shocked. Wade confessed, Roswell asked incredulously. Not exactly, Wilson replied. He died of his wounds shortly after being taken into custody. But before he passed, he made a statement claiming full responsibility for planning the robbery. He also implicated a man named Cassidy but made no mention of a third accomplice. Blackwell frowned. That contradicts what you told us, Ingram. Why would Wade do that? Jane wondered aloud. Roswell looked dazed. I have no idea. Wade wasn't the type to protect anyone but himself. Wilson continued. The stage company considers the matter closed, with the money recovered and the perpetrators either dead or accounted for. They've instructed the Butt authorities not to pursue any additional investigations. A heavy silence fell as the implications became clear. Sheriff Blackwell finally broke it. Well, Mr. Ingram, it appears you've been granted an unexpected reprieve. Without charges from Butt and with both Wade and Cassidy dead, I have no reason to hold you. He produced a ring of keys and unlocked the cell door. You're free to go. Jane could scarcely believe what she was hearing. She turned to Roswell, who stood frozen in disbelief. Are you certain, Sheriff? Roswell asked cautiously. The law is the law, Blackwell replied. Without formal charges, I can't keep you in custody. Though I'd suggest you take this second chance seriously, Ingram. Not many men get one. I will, Roswell promised solemnly. You have my word. As they stepped out of the sheriff's office into the bright Montana sunlight, Jane felt almost dizzy with relief and confusion. What happens now? She asked. Roswell took a deep breath of free air, his expression thoughtful. I'm not sure. I still intend to speak with Sam Miller about that ranch hand position. Honest work, like we discussed. And us, Jane ventured hesitantly. Roswell turned to her, his eyes serious. Jane, what you said in there about waiting for me, it means more than I can express. But I have nothing to offer you right now. No home, no money, just the clothes on my back and a past I'm trying to leave behind. I don't need money or possessions, Jane said. I have a home, one that needs a man's strength to help it thrive. And as for your past, we all have one. It's what you do now that matters. Roswell studied her face, searching for any sign of doubt or uncertainty. Finding none, he reached out to gently touch her cheek. Are you sure about this, Jane? About me? I've never been more certain of anything, she replied simply. A slow smile spread across his face, transforming it with a joy she'd never seen there before. Then, Miss Davenport, I believe we should return to your homestead and start rebuilding our lives together. They left Helena the following day, after purchasing supplies and a horse for Roswell. The ride back to the homestead was filled with conversation about the future plans for expanding the garden, adding to the livestock, perhaps building an addition to the cabin someday. Simple dreams, but precious in their possibility. As they approached the homestead, Jane felt a momentary anxiety. Would it still feel like home after what had happened there? But as the familiar silhouette of the cabin came into view against the backdrop of pine trees, a sense of rightness washed over her. This was where she belonged, where they belonged. Roswell insisted on checking the property thoroughly, before allowing Jane to enter the cabin, concerned that Wade might have had other associates. But everything was just as they had left it, peaceful in the late afternoon light. That evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the Montana sky in brilliant oranges and purples, Roswell took Jane's hand in his. "I've been thinking about what Wade did, taking the blame for the robbery without mentioning me." "It is strange," Jane agreed. "He seemed determined to kill you at the homestead." "Maybe in his final moments he found a scrap of decency," Roswell mused, "or maybe he just wanted to spite Cassidy by making sure he took all the blame." He shrugged. "I suppose we'll never know for certain." "Does it matter?" Jane asked. "You've been given a second chance, Roswell. What matters is what you do with it." He nodded slowly. "You're right, and I promise you, Jane, I won't waste it. I'll work every day to be worthy of the trust you've placed in me." "I know you will," she said softly. Roswell's gaze turned thoughtful as he looked out over the land. "Your father built something good here, something that will last. I want to help you preserve it, make it stronger." "We will," Jane assured him, "together." In the weeks that followed, they fell into a rhythm of shared work and growing affection. Roswell proved himself to be as capable as Jane had hoped, taking on the heaviest labor without complaint and bringing a fresh perspective to the management of the homestead. He rode into Helena occasionally to meet with Sam Miller, who agreed to buy horses that Roswell trained, an arrangement that allowed him to contribute financially while remaining based at the homestead. As autumn approached, bringing cooler temperatures and shorter days, Jane and Roswell's relationship deepened. What had begun as an unlikely alliance between a wounded outlaw and his rescuer had blossomed into genuine love. They spoke often of the future they would build together, though neither rushed to define exactly what form that future would take. One crisp September evening, as they sat by the fire after a long day's work, Roswell suddenly rose and knelt before Jane's chair. From his pocket, he produced a simple silver band purchased, he explained, on his last trip to Helena. "Jane Davenport," he said, his voice steady despite the emotion evident in his eyes. "You found me when I was at my lowest, you fought for my life when others had left me for dead, and you believed in me when I didn't believe in myself. I love you more than I ever thought possible, and if you'll have me, I want to spend the rest of my days proving that your faith in me wasn't misplaced." Tears filled Jane's eyes as she extended her hand. "Yes," she whispered. "1,000 times yes." They were married 2 weeks later in Helena, a small ceremony with only a few witnesses: Mrs. Peterson from the boarding house, Sheriff Blackwell, and old Sam Miller, who had become something of a mentor to Roswell. The newlyweds returned to their homestead that evening, now truly their shared home in every sense. Winter came early that year, blanketing the Montana landscape in snow and confining Jane and Roswell largely to the cabin. They used the time to plan for spring, sketching designs for an expanded barn, calculating how many additional cattle they could sustain, discussing the possibility of planting apple trees along the southern edge of the property. By the time the snow began to melt in late March, Jane had news of her own to share. She was expecting their first child, due to arrive as the summer waned. Roswell's joy at the announcement was boundless. He immediately set to work creating a cradle from pine harvested from their own land, his skilled hands shaping the wood with loving precision. Their son, Thomas James Ingram, was born on a hot August day in 1877, almost exactly 1 year after Jane had found Roswell bleeding beside Cedar Creek. As Roswell held his son for the first time, tears streaming unashamedly down his face, he whispered a promise to the tiny infant that he would grow up knowing only his father's best self, never the man who had once ridden with thieves. Over the years, the Ingram homestead prospered. Roswell's talent with horses became renowned in the region, bringing a steady income that allowed them to expand their holdings and improve their home. Jane's garden flourished, and her preserves won ribbons at the territorial fair. Thomas was joined by a sister, Margaret, in 1879, and another brother, William, in 1882. Occasionally, travelers passing through would bring news of the wider world, the ongoing conflicts with native tribes, the expansion of the railroad, the growing settlements throughout the territory. But the outside world, with all its turbulence and change, seemed distant from the peaceful life the Ingrams had built on their 10th wedding anniversary. Roswell surprised Jane by taking her to the spot where she had found him all those years ago. The creek still flowed, unchanged by the passing of a decade, but everything else had transformed. Where once there had been a desperate man clinging to life, now stood a family, Roswell and Jane, their 3 children, and the promise of many more years together. "Do you ever think about how differently things might have turned out?" Jane asked as they watched their children playing along the creek bank. "If I hadn't heard those shots that day, or if I'd decided not to investigate." Roswell's arm tightened around her waist. "I try not to dwell on it. The thought of never having known you, never having our children, it's too painful to contemplate." Jane leaned her head against his shoulder. "I believe we were meant to find each other, Roswell, that even if it hadn't happened that day, somehow our paths would have crossed eventually." "Perhaps," he said, pressing a kiss to her temple. "But I'm grateful it happened when it did. You saved more than my life that day, Jane. You saved my soul." As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the Montana landscape they both loved, Roswell and Jane called their children to them. Together, the family made their way home, not to a homestead built on solitude and survival, but to one founded on redemption, second chances, and a love born in the most unlikely of circumstances. The wounded cowboy who had once been left for dead had found not just healing for his body, but a healing of spirit that only true love could provide. And the woman who had fought so fiercely for his life had gained a partner who matched her strength, her courage, and her capacity for love, proof that even in the wild uncertainty of the frontier, 2 souls could find in each other exactly what they needed to build a life of meaning and joy.